Welcome back to the All Turtles podcast, a show about the future of work, the future of health, and the entrepreneurs building the future with tech such as AI. I'm Jessica Collier, one of the co-founders of All Turtles, and today I'm interviewing Brian Christian. Brian is the co-author of Algorithms to Live By with Tom Griffiths. He's also the author of The Most Human Human, which was a Wall Street Journal bestseller, a New York Times editor's choice book, and a New Yorker favorite book of the year. It also inspired a documentary called More Human Than Human. Today, I have questions for him about how AI is impacting the way we think about humanity and communication. So we're here with Brian. Hi, Brian. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. So the PhD in me is really embarrassed to say that I haven't read your books, and that's mostly because I'm standing in for one of our other hosts who had prepared to do this interview and is sick today.
Oh, no.
Yeah, exactly. However, I think this might be kismet because I have a deep and abiding love for humanists who kind of reside within technology.
Yeah.
And this means I get to ask you really kind of baseline questions. Like, can you please outline the major argument of your 2011 book, The Most Human Human?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, my first book is called The Most Human Human. And the slightly unusual title comes from this idea that's called the Turing test. So this, I'm sure, will be familiar to some listeners, but it goes back to the famous 1950 paper by Alan Turing, where he asks this question: can a machine think? And if someday we manage to build a machine that can think, how will we know that we've succeeded? And he proposes a practical, actual test to determine this. Like, this is not a philosophical question per se. This is sort of an engineering question. So what's the spec? And the spec is something that has come to be known as the Turing test, which is you have these 5-minute conversations. One is with a random stranger hidden in a room down the hall. The other is with a computer program claiming to be a random stranger hidden in a room down the hall. And it's the judge's job to determine who is the real stranger and who is the computer imposter. And Turing makes this famous prediction that by the beginning of the 21st century, we will be guessing wrong 30% of the time. And this becomes this famous threshold that has come to be known as passing the Turing test. And this idea of Turing's, which really began as kind of a thought experiment, became, starting in the early 1990s, an actual annual competition bankrolled by this colorful millionaire from New Jersey named Hugh Loebner, who made his fortune selling plastic portable light-up disco dance floors. I mean, you can't make these things up. And so they had been holding one of these competitions every year, starting in 1992. And I got really interested after the 2008 competition because the top computer program that year had managed to fool 25% of the judges. And so it was just a single vote short of crossing this threshold. And so, you know, the London Times is running this headline, "Humanity dodges a bullet." And, you know, many people are thinking, you know, is the following year's competition, 2009, the year that the machines finally cross this kind of line in the sand? And some sort of voice rose up inside me and said, "Not on my watch." So the plot of this book is that I contact the organizers and insinuate myself into this competition as one of the human, you know, one of the members of the human defense, one of the strangers hidden in this room down the hall with 5 minutes on the clock to persuade someone that I'm a human being. And so the title of the book, The Most Human Human, comes from the way that this test is set up, which is that every judge assigns a numerical score to each conversation that represents how confident they were that they were speaking to a real person. And the computer program, each year that gets the highest score wins what's called the Most Human Computer Prize. You get a small research grant and a bronze medallion. But there's also, of course, every year a real person who gets the highest score out of all of the real people. And this person wins what is called the Most Human Award. And so I became just absolutely fascinated and preoccupied with this, winning this title, which would mean essentially not just being more persuasively human than all of the computer programs, but in fact also being more unmistakably human than the other people.
What are the characteristics of the most human? Like at you, what characteristics do you have that make you eligible to receive this award?
Yeah, I mean, there was something counterintuitive in a way, which was that everyone else participating in the competition had been just recruited off the street, essentially. Mm-hmm. They'd been recruited out of a science conference that was happening that same week. Whereas I was essentially a ringer. I had been studying the Turing test full time at that point for 6 months. I had read something like 800 pages of transcripts of all the previous year's competitions. I had been going around interviewing, computer scientists, linguists, philosophers, psychologists, asking them, if you were in my shoes and you had 5 minutes to somehow convince someone you were human, what would you do? And what does your particular disciplinary background suggest that I might do? And so I took this way more seriously than I think anyone had ever taken it. And so at some level, I felt like, okay, well, I ought to win because I'm trying so much harder than anyone else. At the same time, there is, of course, something paradoxical in that everyone else was just being natural.
Right.
And I was coming in with a very explicit strategy. And so...
to be human.
Yeah. So there was a very real chance that was going to backfire.
Well, what did they say, these people you asked for advice from, to how to come off as human, philosophers and psychologists? Like, what was the advice they gave you?
Everyone gave me a little bit of a different take on it. And I tried to synthesize those nuggets into an actual strategy. One person, for example, was telling me, you should use fake words. Humans have this ability not only to use language, but to kind of play with it, misuse it deliberately. Mm-hmm. That's part of the kind of mischievous poetic spirit.
I was going to say, you're also a poet, so that comes easily.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think for me, there was something very interesting about studying how these programs were actually constructed. And so essentially there were, at that time, 2 main architectures for how these chatbot programs were built. They were either written almost like a choose-your-own-adventure, where they were highly scripted, but if you wandered off the path of what the conversation was supposed to be, they would have no recourse other than to just kind of get back onto this, golden path.
Yes. Yes.
So then on the other hand, there was kind of a second school of thought and this second generation of chatbots that had been built almost like a conversational wiki, where they had just scraped internet chat forums. And in one case, the chatbot developer had created a website where you could talk to his program. And so, of course, it was logging everything that everyone said to it and cobbling together these kind of little snippets of conversation. So anytime you would say anything to this program that had already seen someone else say on the internet, it would give the response essentially that remark had actually gotten. And so you can get this uncanny human likeness, but it's very local. It's a single question and a single response. But you start to slowly get the sense that you're not talking to the same person every time. Like sometimes it would spell the word color with the American spelling, sometimes with the British spelling, or sometimes it would refer to being single, other times it would refer to their spouse. And so you had to kind of outwit each of these different genres of program differently. And so for me, I had kind of this double-sided strategy, which was on the one hand, being willing to drive the conversation off on a tangent and prove that I could sort of hang no matter where we went to, which is an idea that in the book is called getting out of book, which is this chess analogy. We can delve into if you're interested. But the other strategy was, in some sense, the reverse, which was no matter how diverse a set of things I was responding to, or no matter how far afield the conversation went, I was extremely hyper-conscious of coming across like a single unified person. So, for example, there was another guy there who was another one of the human Confederates, as they're known.
Wait, the human side on this competition is referred to as the Confederates?
The Confederates, yes.
Is that, and that's not an American Civil War reference, or?
It is a psychology reference.
Okay.
So often the Confederate in a psychology study is someone who seems like a participant, but they're actually in cahoots with the experimenter. So it's kind of a reference to that. It's
okay.
like we're secretly on the same team as the judges.
But this was a confederacy of humans who are not dunces. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, so there was, for example, there was a moment where one of my fellow Confederates, a guy named Dave, began his conversation by saying, "Good day, mate." And then the judge asked him, "Oh, have you come far to be here?" And he said, "Oh, not that far, just from the Southwest U.S." And I observed this happening, and I thought that is a classic tactical error, because you must sort of be hyper-conscious of trying to come across like you're not assembled out of a random wiki of chat transcripts. Right. So in my case, at the time, I was living in Seattle, and so one of the judges was making small talk with me and said, "What do you think about this weather?" And this was in the UK. So I said, "Well, the weather's pretty crappy, but that's par for the course. I'm from Seattle." And then later we started talking about music, and so I immediately thought, I should reference grunge music so that it's clear that like this is the same person who's familiar with Gray Skies is also familiar with, Pearl Jam. That would make sense. And so I did what I could to portray myself maybe over and above what I normally would do, to create a sense that this is the same not just a person talking, but the same person talking throughout the interaction.
It's interesting because it's also imitating a level of like social grace and consistency and kind of adherence to the topic at hand that a lot of humans are not actually very adept at.
That's right. Yeah.
Because what you want the exchange to feel like, it sounds like, is a single kind of associative back and forth rather than an assemblage of sort of random reciprocal exchanges that then lead to another random reciprocal exchange.
That's right.
But that's assuming that that most humans have like a grasp of the art of conversation. That's right. That might be that might be assuming a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, so for me, that was the irony of writing the book, which was I thought it was going to be a book about artificial intelligence. In some ways, the plot twist for me writing it was that it was really a book about the art of conversation. That really the Turing test meant trying to have a good human conversation.
And what does that mean?
And what does, yeah. And, there are many people who have argued, including the Oxford University philosopher John Lucas, that if machines consistently pass the Turing test, it is not because they have become so human, but because we have become so wooden.
Right.
And I do think that for me, there is a kind of a cultural critique in the Turing test, which is that I think about, this is going to sound like this cantankerous, old person speaking, but
go for it.
But I feel like we're witnessing an amazing kind of degradation of conversation. I make the point in the book that most people don't realize that the etymology of the word calling someone was to call upon them. Like you have to actually go to where they live. And so we virtualize that, now you just send your voice. Increasingly that feels intrusive. And so we have asynchronous things like email, we have text, etc. And for me, the great irony of the communication revolution that we've experienced with cell phones and the internet is that as we have created infrastructure moving more and more of these bits around, we've somehow counterintuitively opted for lower and lower and lower bandwidth modes of actually communicating with each other. So we're sowing the seeds for our own Turing test destruction,
Right.
if you want to think about it that way.
I imagine that there's something related to diminishing attention spans in there too, right? If the way machines claim to be human is to carry on kind of a long associative train of thought with someone else, a lot of people can't do that anymore because we don't have the kind of practice at long associative trains of thought and conversation.
Yeah.
And so what happens then? Do we need to kind of reprogram machines to imitate humans in the way that humans have become?
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking one of the early failures in the history of the Turing test in the early 90s, there was back in those days, the conversations were topic constrained because they thought it would be too hard to have a totally open conversation. And one of the programs was given the topic whimsical conversation, which I don't know if that's a topic, it's more of a style.
Right.
But no matter what you said, it would just kind of make some pun using a word that you had said, or it would make some wisecrack.
Interesting.
And this turned out to be the most human computer of that particular year.
Huh.
And for me, I think it ends up being kind of a damning indictment of that style of communication. And I know people in real life who communicate in that way.
Yeah.
You know,
our most annoying friends, most insufferable companions. Yes.
You know, and there can be those moments where one finds oneself trying to maintain this thread, this continuity, but whatever you say, the person just starts kind of freestyling off of, you know, some word that you've used or some quote that resembles what you've been talking about.
Right.
And, then you have to try. I mean, I think those moments can enliven a conversation, but there's more to it than just free associating.
Yeah, totally. One of the phenomena around the sort of, you know, are people able to determine whether they're interacting with a machine or with a human? One of the most interesting phenomena around that for me is that it has kind of gotten flipped on its head a little bit, so that what I frequently see as a person who works with a lot of different kinds of conversational interfaces is people assuming from the outset that they're talking to a machine, right? So that they'll often accuse a human who is interacting with them over a chat interface of being a machine.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's rather than kind of machines attempting to imitate humans to the point where they might actually be able to fool them and kind of do the job that a human would have been able to do. It's almost like humans are kind of accused of being machines,
right,
and not even achieving the level of competence that a human should be able to give.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's this irony now of, you know, it feels like there's these two threads of scandal that go through Silicon Valley, which is like the service that was marketed as being human-powered was actually machine learning.
Yes.
And the machine learning service was actually just people, you know, in some low-wage area,
right,
you know, pretending to be the machine learning script. So that's quite surreal. And I don't know that Alan Turing would have anticipated the deception would run
both
in
ways.
Both directions.
Right.
I think there's something to the critique of people being forced to or constrained to act in ways that essentially render them as machines. So, you know, the book contains some of my, you know, most memorable call center interactions, you know, of that period in my life.
Call centers are definitely the thing you think of immediately. Right?
Yeah. So
call centers, customer support, those kinds of roles and functions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And essentially what you have is the person's autonomy in many cases is constrained to the point where they're basically doing, you know, speech to text. They listen to you say something, they key that in to a system. The system then gives them a response, and then they read that response to you verbatim. And essentially they are a chatbot that's just running on a human brain rather than running on a computer.
Right. Yes. And I'm curious, given the kind of the rise of the chatbot, or I guess you might say the renaissance of the chatbot in the last 10 years or so, how has your thinking around this changed since you published the book in 2011?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me to think about that. So yeah, I wrote the book in 2010. It came out in 2011. So it predated Siri by 6 months.
Oh,
this is like prehistory at this point.
Right.
I think...
What impeccable timing for you, though.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think it was kind of ahead. I think in some ways, I actually think the book would have had a greater impact if it had come out 4 or 5 years later. One of the things that I've thought about often since its publication was, Alan Turing approached this question for its kind of intrinsic philosophical interest, but I don't think he would have foreseen that this would become just one of the intrinsic nuisances of life in the developed world. That, you get a certain email or text that's asking, it's like ostensibly comes from someone but the way it's written, you're not sure if it's really them. It's something fishy about it. You are being conscripted into the role of judge in a Turing test. And this is happening every single day. And in some ways, I think the stakes are now, we perceive them to be even higher than that. Namely, public discourse politically is overrun to some degree or other. It's really hard to estimate, with kind of scalable, insincere speech. And I think that's only going to get worse. I mean, so even within the last 12 months, you've seen now what I would say is kind of the third generation technology for chatbots, which are these neural network models like Google's BERT or OpenAI's GPT-2. And it seems like a matter of time before there will just be no telling, if you're on Twitter or on Reddit, where something is coming from and if it's been generated, at scale. So I think this is an open problem for democracy. I think it's an open problem for just this concept of anonymous discourse. What's the future of that? Will we find ourselves in a place where, you can't go on a forum for product X without assuming that 90% of the comments are generated by like pro-X shillbots and anti-X shillbots run by the competitors. And so what space does that leave for people who, sincerely want to engage on something? So that to me feels, in 2020, like one of these question marks that's kind of hanging. It's not clear to me what the future of that's going to be. I know Jack Dorsey has talked about having a green check mark next to your name that indicates this person is a human being. We've somehow verified that. But it's not clear what that even means, because people can use various scripting tools to schedule tweets and blah, 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 blah. There's a huge gray area between something being, direct human communication.
Well, and imagine the hierarchy that would result if you are a human who is a rather high-profile person who could very easily be verified as a human, and then there's lots of just normal, everyday, workaday humans who would have probably a much harder time getting their quote-unquote humanity verified.
Right. And the paradox there is that the high-profile person also likely has staff doing their social media for them.
Right.
So it might be a person, but it's probably not that person.
Right, exactly.
I remember someone had done some ML on Donald Trump's Twitter feed during the 2016 election. And it was just this very obvious bimodal distribution of like, this set of tweets comes from an iPhone. These set of tweets comes from an Android device. These set of tweets come, from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. These other set of tweets come at like 4 a.m. on a Sunday. And it was just very clear that there were two different entities, namely Trump himself and his social media manager or staff.
Yeah.
Using the same account, and it was not particularly difficult to pull those two things apart.
Yeah, it's so interesting because anybody who's ever text banked for a politician knows the feeling of sort of being a live human purveyor of what are essentially automated messages, right? And the reason for that is that there's legislation in place to prevent political campaigns from setting up bots that just kind of spew text messages out to voters, right? And so the way to get around that is to just have humans manually spew out the automated messages to voters.
There's a huge gray area there. There was a big scandal a few years ago where there was this company like automatically calling people in America on the phone, and they'd be talking to this ostensibly, Caucasian female voice. But there would be these sort of, there was a certain awkwardness to the conversation that led certain people to suspect, I can't tell what's going on, but I don't think I'm really talking to this woman. And it was later determined that there was a call center, I think in the Philippines or somewhere in Asia, where there were rooms full of people essentially DJing clips of this woman's voice. So they were having these conversations by, pressing play on these various samples of this other woman's voice.
To cue like the next clip of the thing that she said previously. Wow.
Yeah. And so where does that, so you are hearing a real human's voice, but the person you're talking to isn't that person, but they're still controlling what you say. And
like a chatbot, there are only so many, or like the sort of choose your own adventure versions of bots, there are only so many responses that one can queue up, right? Because everything is previously determined.
Yes, although we're probably not far from the point where you can use some kind of like neural text-to-speech thing that sounds pretty good. So you could easily find yourself in a conversation with someone who is producing all of that speech live, but is not the actual source of the voice that you're hearing. So we are really just wandering into this very surreal world where we don't necessarily know what the parameters of any given conversation are. We have to sort of feel it out by intuition of like, oh, this person just used the same exact phrase twice in a row. Like, that's a little weird.
Right.
What's going on?
It seems like this might be a good moment to revisit your book that was published 9 years ago. Yeah.
For better or worse, I think it's become more critical, and not just the book itself, but the skill of being a discerning participant in these conversations, having that kind of spider sense for when you're, the interaction isn't exactly what it's purporting to be.
Right.
But also, what does it mean? So what does it mean to be a good judge in that case? But also, what does it mean to be a good confederate? So I give the example in the book. Again, this feels like a simpler time where I would find some cool link on the internet and I would just send it to a friend of mine, and the subject would be like, hey, and the body would just be the URL. And somewhere around the late aughts, messages like that started getting caught in people's spam filters.
Yeah.
And so increasingly, as we feel that from sort of a computer security standpoint, the risks of clicking random URLs and emails have gone up, there's this accordant pressure as the sender of that email to kind of perform your identity in some way.
Yeah,
like
totally.
Make some kind of inside joke or say something in a very Brian-esque manner, which is a sort of a form of authentication almost.
Oh, God, that's so interesting. I want to make sure we have just a moment to talk about your other book, which is called Algorithms to Live By. And again, I haven't read it, but I'm definitely going to now. Can you give us kind of the argument and what the book covers?
Yeah, absolutely. So Algorithms to Live By is a collaboration with my longtime friend, Tom Griffiths, who is a cognitive scientist at Princeton. And both of us have been kind of obsessively interested over the years in this question of to what degree can we think about the structure of human decision-making and human problems in computational terms? And so this book was really a joint exploration of that idea. And so you can think about things like how to manage your time. Well, there's an entire field in computer science called scheduling theory. Every operating system has what's called the kernel scheduler, which is a bit of code to tell the CPU, what do you work on next and for how long, and then what do you switch to? Now, all of this is happening at, the millisecond scale or less, but there are still principles that are useful for thinking about human time management. And even at just the most basic level, if you think about trying to get an apartment in San Francisco, it's extremely competitive. There's this sense that if you don't immediately act, then that opportunity is gone. Someone else is just going to get it. And so you find yourself in a situation which is not the normal consumer situation where you would ordinarily just consider a string of options, gather data about each one, and then, weigh them out to determine which one's the best fit. Rather, you find yourself in a situation where at each point in time, you're presented with an option and you must either take it on the spot and never know what else might be out there, or continue to gather more information and explore other alternatives, but lose the opportunity to go back and change your mind. And so this particular structure of decision-making is called optimal stopping. And there's a very famous optimal stopping problem that's called the secretary problem, which has this famous solution. And I think it's fairly analogous to the apartment hunt. So you can say, what should I do? Let's say I have a month to find a new place. How do I give myself the very best chance of getting the best apartment that's out there? Well, it seems there's some intuitive balance between gathering information, which helps you kind of set a threshold, and then being willing to kind of pounce on something that meets that threshold. But it's not really clear off the bat what that balance between looking and leaping should be.
Right.
The math tells you it's 37%. So
really?
Yeah.
Really, the math has an answer?
1 over E to be exact. Yeah. So you
That's
should
kind of
spend
comforting.
the first 1 over E of the month, which is about 11 days. Leave the checkbook at home. Just explore options, get a baseline, and then you should immediately commit to the very next apartment that you see after that point, which is better than everything you saw in the original 11 days.
Okay.
So that's the kind of thing that we get into in the book, is exploring these familiar human dilemmas through this algorithmic lens and saying, what are the principles that we can take from this computational perspective that give us hopefully some insight, not necessarily an exact recipe that you must follow to the letter, because life isn't like that, but a bit of vocabulary for understanding the structure of these problems and what are the general properties of their solutions.
So how to fold more machine-like behavior into your human
in a
existence
funny way,
in the world. Yeah.
But it counterintuitively, perhaps, the advice that we arrive at doesn't look like what you might expect in a book that's about, living your life by the principles of computer science. So
What's
you
the
get things like
twist?
You should think less hard. Don't always go for the thing that looks best every time. Explore your options. Make a mess on occasion. So in the chapter on sorting and searching, we talk about what's called the sort-search trade-off. And so in computer science, really the only reason to sort something is so that you can search it efficiently later.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't expect to save more time searching it than you'll spend sorting it, then you shouldn't sort it at all.
Right.
And so there's kind of this computational argument for mess,
right,
which is quite lovely.
Like sometimes the mess is just more efficient in the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we get into, what is the most effective way of alphabetizing your bookshelf, but more importantly, should you?
Right. Nice.
And we come down on the side of mess. So, that there's some liberating advice there.
That's really cool. And can I ask, what are you working on now?
Yeah, I just finished a book, which will be out in the fall.
Mm.
It's called The Alignment Problem, and this looks at human values in machine learning. So increasingly, we are developing these machine learning systems and using them in society, whether it's, here in California, there's this bill, SB 10.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bail reform bill, and one of the more controversial aspects is that it's going to eliminate cash bail and replace it with mandatory use in each of California's counties of an algorithmic risk assessment tool, which will determine when someone is charged with something, are they held pending their trial or are they released pending their trial? And so suddenly you have all of these California counties figuring out this procurement process of, well, what would a good tool look like? And so we're getting...
That could go so badly.
It could.
Yeah.
And so there's a long story of, what are the properties that we would want such an instrument to have?
Mm-hmm.
How do we try to articulate in, statistical, numerical language our social values? How does fairness operationalize in one of these supervised learning instruments? What are the things that we would hope such a tool would have? And are all of those things actually mutually satisfiable? Or do we have to make some hard trade-offs?
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's kind of this further into the medium term question of AI, technical AI safety. So the book looks at the development of this field of technical AI safety and the beginning of really a research agenda around this question of how do we try to imbue these complex and sometimes ineffable human norms into machines. And so it's a look at kind of a field just starting to find its legs and the race, if you will, between our ability to imbue these systems with a sense of our norms, our values, versus just the actual speed of the technological deployment itself. So it's harrowing in that sense, but also it's hopeful to some degree because this is kind of this new area within the field of AI that I think is one of the most exciting things that's happening in AI.
We could all use a little hope right now.
That's right. I'll take whatever hope I can get.
Exactly.
That's right.
And if people want to order your new book, when can they do that?
I think currently it's on Amazon with a pub date, but no cover yet. So this is early days. But my website is brianchristian.org, and the book is called The Alignment Problem, and it'll be out in October.
Awesome. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now it's time for a listener question. This one comes in from Jordan via email. Jordan says he's a big fan. I've listened to every episode of your podcast. Thanks, Jordan. Anyways, I just finished reading Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, which is all about the downside to big data, how it makes the lives of poor people worse because they get thrown into categories in each algorithm and are forced to live with the results, even if someone's mislabeled, while the rich get treated individually. Thus, it's easier for the poor to get caught in an automated, negatively reinforced death spiral with one algorithm piling on after another. Like he gives an example, like with the use of demographic data to target poor people and charge them a surplus because they're less likely to know better or less able to put up a fight. Or with micro-campaigning and gerrymandering and blah, blah, blah. Politicians and parties choosing votes rather than voters choosing politicians and parties. I'm very much a proponent of AI and big data, but we mustn't forget the poor and the weak, as not everyone is going to use these powerful tools for the betterment of mankind. So, Jordan, that's quite a statement. He asked if we've read the book or if we have thoughts on this idea and the downsides to big data and AI.
I have read the book. I think it's really good. And I think most of the points it makes are really legit. I think a lot of what passes for big data is actually really bad for the world, for many of the reasons that Jordan said, and for lots of others as well. Yeah, in fact, I've become, I think, more of a skeptic about, or at least less blanket optimistic about the effects of AI and big data in the past couple of years. I think there's a particular style of American capitalism, not just American, really, kind of global, but it's particular American capitalism. I think the U.S. kind of does this more than anyone else, which is all about it's about labeling people so that you can market to them most precisely, and that's may seem like a kind of innocuous concept, but actually I think it has all sorts of really bad repercussions on democracy and on society. And like with everything else, I think poor people tend to get the worst of it just because that's true of everything. Like if you have money, you tend to be able to use that money to have an advantage in many areas of life. And if you don't, you usually get the worst end of the bargain. So yeah, I think this is all true. In terms of what to do about it, I think we've talked about it a bunch in the podcast. I think it comes down to the people who are creating these things, us, need to understand that it's our responsibility to make the world that we want to live in. And so I think we need to be specific about measuring how we want the world to go and making sure that we're not doing anything that goes against those measurements, and really just understanding that no one else is going to do it for us. I think we talked about this a lot on a previous podcast series we did with Hemant around his Unscaled book. I think we covered a lot of these topics in a lot of detail. But yeah, it's kind of a minefield unless you take it very seriously.
I think it's important to note that the use case Jordan's describing and the one you're describing, it's a marketing use case. Like there's plenty of good things that we're using data for just increasing access to information or certain services or things like healthcare.
The world is better than it's ever been in many dimensions, but not in all dimensions. And I think humans have a general negativity bias, which is it's not inappropriate. Like we should focus, we should over-index on the things that are going wrong, and thereby fix them. So I think it's appropriate to spend more time talking about what's going wrong with the big data world than what's going right, even though, yeah, obviously there's lots of things going right.
Yeah, fair point. Thanks, Jordan. And if you have any other listener questions, you can send us an email at hello@all-turtles.com or tweet us at @allturtlesco.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatella Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Brian Christian for joining us this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message and will write back. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plug for his audio expertise, Micah Rivera for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of John Cifuentes, Phil Libin, and me, Jessica Collier, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.